upon you, which your word says is as the sin of witchcraft. So Lord, help us to understand that, how to press on in faith, knowing that you will direct our steps without being presumptuous and doing our own thing and believing that if we put a cross on it, God's going to bless us. Lord, give us that kind of wisdom and more than we even know to ask for. Beyond all that, give us the love that makes us want to draw near to you, that makes us want to know you, that makes us want to gaze upon you so intimately in a way that we know what you want from us without having to go about some giant search, that we're led by your Spirit, walking by your Spirit in a very natural, simple way. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All righty, so we are continuing our journey through Acts chapter 27. Here at Calvary Chapel, we go verse by verse through books of the Bible. We have almost worked our way through the book of Acts, which has been an exciting ride. But to start off with a story, back in the 70s, my dad picked up a hitchhiker. I guess people used to do that back then, before my parents warned me never to do that. But just out of curiosity, who here has ever picked up a hitchhiker? Yeah, okay, most of us. So my dad picks up a hitchhiker. He says he's a galley chef from boats on the Great Lakes. And he said one time he was up in Wisconsin, and it was kind of late in the season. It was November 9th, and he fell sick and had to cancel. And the name of the ship that he canceled on, where they found a new guy to jump in as the galley chef, was the Edmund Fitzgerald. Okay, so you guys have heard this story before, huh? Yeah, and actually I was like, wow, that sounds pretty sensational. But his story checks out. According to the history, there was a galley chef who bowed out. Whether it was actually the hitchhiker, who knows? But it could have been this guy. Anyhow, he was supposed to be on the Edmund Fitzgerald, which apparently you guys know where that is going. Because even since ancient times, since the book of Acts, after November 11th, you should not be out on the ocean or on the sea, in the Mediterranean Sea, let alone the Atlantic. But the Mediterranean Sea, after November 11th, it was considered a death wish. And the time between there, the October heading into November was considered the treacherous season where, if you really wanted to take your life in your hands, you could go out on the water, but it was dangerous. Of course, November 9th is when the Edmund Fitzgerald took off with its 29 members and crew of 26,000 tons of ore. And as you're perhaps aware, they knew that they were going to be heading into a storm late in the season, and they thought they could skirt along the lee of Canada to try to stay out of the worst of it. And they were in the storm for 24 hours as they began to take damage, and the ship began to list off to the side. And the last radio contact, the captain of 63 years said they were holding their own, whereafter it went radio silent. As you know, the crew of the Edmund Fitzgerald went down with its 26,000 tons of ore and 29 crew members, because the seas have always known to be dangerous. I mean, that's not even the sea, that's a lake, right? And still, you can go down so easily, especially late in the season. In fact, every year, 2,000 U.S. mariners drown. And it's estimated that globally, 100,000 fishermen drown every year, right? And that's not commercial transport, that is just fishermen. 100,000 fishermen drown in open waters every year. The seas have always been dangerous. They are still dangerous, and they are dangerous in the story we're about to read. If they're still dangerous, so dangerous today, where most people are in giant metal vessels being propelled by giant diesel engines, if they're dangerous today, you can imagine how dangerous they must have been in Paul's day. Dangerous enough that Paul has already been shipwrecked 3 times by the time we read this story. Right? He writes before this in year 54 that he had been shipwrecked 3 times already. Right? And so he knows a little bit about shipwrecks. But this one we're going to have from an eyewitness account. We're going to have it straight from Luke, because Luke gets to experience the shipwreck with him this time. Lucky Luke, right? These poor guys accompanying Paul, it's like, gosh, Paul, every time I do something with you, something goes sideways. I guess it's a sign that Paul's doing something right, that somebody's coming against him. But the point is, they're going to be out in the waters in late October. And as it said, the lake, it is said, never gives up her dead when the gales of November come early. So our subject is lost at sea. Our object is don't test your luck. right? Which in spiritual terms is don't put God to the test. There are things that God has promised, and we should absolutely trust God and what he has promised, but we ought not be presumptuous and go beyond what he has promised. We ought not fall short of the word, but we ought to not go presumptuously beyond what he has promised, because that is also a recipe for destruction, and you see that throughout the Bible. For example, just comes to mind King Josiah, the most righteous man that had ever been in the history of Israel. More righteous than David was King Josiah, the most righteous of all the kings, a wonderful man and leader, but he went beyond what God had promised. Right? Necho Pharaoh was just trying to pass through the land of Israel to go fight the Babylonians. So his enemies were going to fight his enemies, but Josiah said, "No, God shall not let my enemies take one footstep in my land. I will fight you." And Necho says, "Why do you want to fight me? You're going to die if you fight me. I don't have a fight with you. I don't have a dog in the fight of your country. I'm going to fight Babylon." God is literally letting your enemies fight your enemies, but he's like, "No, I'm going to stand firm in the promises that my enemies shall not take one foot shall not pass through my land." That's not a promise in the scriptures. Right? I'm embellishing a little bit. He didn't say stand on the promise, but he was going beyond the promise. Oh, the microphone cut off. I'm not allowed to say that. He was going beyond the promise of God. He was acting presumptuously, and although he was the most righteous king that had been, he died for his error, that he went presumptuously beyond what God had promised. So, we ought not fall short of God's promise, but we ought not go beyond what he has promised. His promise is already exceedingly great enough. In fact, I would say it this way. It's not that a man has ever gone beyond God's promise. It's that he's gotten sidetracked off of God's promise. That's maybe a better way to look at it. You get off of the promises of God. Because I don't think anybody has ever fully discovered everything that God has in his promise, but at some point we get sidetracked. And so we want to look out for putting our luck to the test, or putting God to the test, really. So, we are in Acts chapter 27. If you would and you're able, please stand with me for the reading of Scripture. We're not going to read the whole thing. In fact, I'm going to stop about 12. Keep some tension here. "And when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in a ship of Adramyttium, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. And putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus, because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra in Lucia. There a centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days, arriving with difficulty off of Cnidus. And as the wind did not allow us to go further, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salome. Coasting along it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. Since much time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, because even the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, 'Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also our lives.' But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there, on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete facing both southwest and northwest, to spend the winter there." We thank God for his word. You may be seated. So, we will get into the real meat of the next couple verses there, but that's leading up to where we're going. And it says here, "And when it was decided that we should sail for Italy." Now, if you remember, Paul had been a prisoner in Caesarea for years. He has been stuck in Caesarea because the systems of government have not been moving as they ought. He has been stuck there because the governors are so afraid of the Jews that they're failing to make the decision they should make. Of course, we understand why, because this atmosphere in Palestine, as it was called by the Romans, is so intense that it will erupt in a civil war in 7 years. And so they're afraid to set off this powder keg, and so they're not making a decision for Paul. And eventually Paul gets so sick of it, he says, here I ought to be tried, and if I'm not going to be tried here, then I'm going to go to Rome. I appeal to the highest human authority in the world. I appeal to Caesar. And he says, okay, if you appeal to Caesar, then to Caesar you shall go. And now he is finally going out of Caesar. And you can imagine Paul, after having been in prison for years, the relief he feels finally getting to leave that God-forsaken, it probably feels like, room, to finally leave that place, even though it wasn't forsaken by God. God was with him the whole time. Jesus was with him there. He did wonderful things and great ministry from the room and had personal development. But it probably feels pretty God-forsaken. And he finally gets to, come out into the open air. You can imagine the sea breeze, that salty sea breeze finally being on his face again. He's traveled more than most people at that time have traveled, and to finally get that salty sea air blowing in his face is probably, from a human side, just such a sigh of relief. And so, finally, they're about to sail to Rome, a journey he's always wanted to make. When he writes the Romans, he talks about how he wants to come to Rome and to do a work in Rome. Obviously, it is the center of the world at that point in time. The Roman Empire was what the whole rest of the world seems to revolve around. I know that sounds pretty ethnocentric for anybody who would be from Asia, but really, any other empire seems to fail in light of what was going on in Rome. So, of course, he wants to go to Rome and to share the gospel there. And the very fact that Paul goes to Rome is the validity, or the basis upon which the Catholic Church justifies Rome being the center of the church. It says because Paul was beheaded here and Peter was beheaded here, even though nobody can prove that Peter was beheaded there, but because we killed God's best apostles, we get to be the chief city. Which I still don't understand quite how that works, but that seems to be the justification. No, Rome was the center of the world, and even though the emperor, Caesar, will reject Paul's preaching, the fact is that many members of the royal family and the Praetorian Guard will join Christ. They will become Christians, and because of that strong influence of Christ within the royal family and the royal guard, that will probably be part of the reason why Rome eventually becomes a Christian city of a Christian empire. Now, Christian in name, right? We can all debate about what's the difference between a true Christian, a confessing Christian, and a nominal Christian who just jumps on board. We don't have time for that right now, but the fact is, Paul has this bittersweet excitement about finally returning to the sea. Now, as we said, he has been shipwrecked 3 times, but God has already given him the word that he will make it to Rome. We read in chapter 23:11, it said, "Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." So, Paul already has this promise from Jesus. He's going to make it to Rome. So, I mean, technically, he could, in this story today, he could have been like, whatever. You guys can go, you cannot go. I know I'm making it. Whether you guys live is a different matter, right? Whether your cargo survives is a different matter. But I know I'm making it, right? Of course, Paul, he also has Luke with him, and Luke's like, let's choose the path that doesn't include a shipwreck, right? Poor Aristarchus, who suffers a lot with him. And by the way, we'll get to Aristarchus in a moment, but he actually sends greetings from Paul's letters from prison in Rome, which means that Aristarchus really sticks it out with him. Even when Paul remains in captivity in Rome, Aristarchus is there being a right-hand man. It's also possibly the same Aristarchus that got beat up on Paul's behalf back in Macedonia, or in, was that Corinth? Can't recall. Anyhow, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. Now, who are these other prisoners? Most people believe that whatever crimes they had committed, that, the Romans had a thirst for blood sport. And they would send about 10,000 gladiators to their death every year. And obviously, you have to have some people to pull from. So the Romans began making it a practice when somebody commits a crime that is worthy of death, instead of executing them on the spot, if they seem like they would be a good fit for the gladiatorial game. You don't want some, skinny, lame guy, right? You don't want some scrawny fella. You don't want some diseased guy. But if he seems like, this guy could be a fighter, instead of executing him on the spot on a cross, you say, tell you what, buddy, I got a deal for you. Instead of being crucified, you can go fight for your freedom in the gladiatorial games. Well, sounds better than crucifixion. It's a gamble, but let's take a shot. And so they would send these prisoners up to Rome. The Colosseum would be built a few years later, but they had the Circus Maximum, which was actually more seating capacity. The Colosseum had 50,000 seats. The Circus Maximum had 300,000 seats. Giant arena to watch this blood sport. Anyhow, many of these prisoners are probably going up to Rome to die as gladiators or charioteers or something of that nature. And so you can imagine this is a rough and tumble group, and anybody who would be able to keep these rough and tumble guys who are looking for any chance to escape, anybody who can keep them under their thumb is probably a pretty stern dude, right? And then you have here the Augustan cohort, which there are multiple cohorts named Augustan, but it's still a title of honor because, as you probably know, Octavius Augustus was a few years before this, and Augustus was a title he gave himself, which means great. So unlike other leaders who are called great by those who follow them, Octavian says, you know what, I'm so great, you can call me great while I'm still alive. In fact, I'm going to set up an idolatrous system in which you can worship me while I'm still alive. We'll worship Julius Caesar, and you can worship me. That was Octavian Augustus. Other people took this title Augustus, but anyhow, to be associated with this great, significant megalomaniac was considered an honor. And so the Augustinian cohort is some form of honor. And the fact that he's named Julius he's probably named after Julius Caesar. So this guy is probably a Roman of Romans, right? This guy did not go to boot camp. He was raised in boot camp, right? He probably had your stereotypical hard-nosed Roman father. And this will be important, especially as we go through the story. But Ben Witherington writes about how Roman fathers, their best gift to their children was to jerk them out of bed really early in the morning, like 5 a.m. You rip your son out of bed and pretty much say, life's tough, I'm going to help you get used to it, go out there and go to work, right? And that's how Roman fathers bestowed love to their children, was just this kind of rough, life's tough, get a helmet, get up you sluggard, I'm going to somehow try to make you an honorable man, right? That's what this guy was probably raised in. But he becomes a centurion, which was like a sergeant, an NCO. And of the 4 centurions Luke writes about, every one of them is an honorable man. So this guy's strength and honor has probably been his credo since he was born. And this guy is in charge of all these rough and tumble prisoners, and Paul and his super loving Christian guys. So it's an interesting group. And embarking in the ship of Erytrium, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. So Aristarchus, as we said, he's a good companion that you find through multiple letters from Paul. And notice how it says here, we put to sea. That means Luke has jumped back on board. He's on board the ship. What you're about to read is not some secondhand account. This is firsthand. He's going back from biography to autobiography, right? So what we are about to read, he knows. If you remember last time, he said it was somewhere between 8 to 10 days because he was using other sources. But here he knows the exact number of days because he is cataloging everything precisely because he is the eyewitness to everything we're about to read. The next day we put in at Sidon, the famous Tyre and Sidon, those twin cities of mercantile trade. And Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. Now, knowing everything that we just said about Julius, this is probably surprising. There is no human reason why Julius would need to send Paul away, give him free leave, because as you probably know, by Roman rule, if a prisoner gets lost under your care, his discipline, his punishment becomes your punishment, which means if Paul is to be condemned to death and he loses Paul, Julius is put to death. And yet Julius, recognizing that this was a man of great character, seeing that he was a principled man, maybe honor recognizes honor, he gives Paul leave to go and be cared for because back then prisons didn't give you food. You had to have friends care for you. And maybe this guy even heard stories from Macedonia. If you remember Philippi was the Roman colony in Macedonia. Maybe he heard stories about when the Macedonian jail got rocked, the doors flung open, and Paul stayed in prison so that his guard would not be killed. Maybe he heard those stories and thought, well, if this guy didn't flee when he had the chance, then I can trust him to go. In essence, in judicial terms, he's deemed not a flight risk. And so he gets to go under, I would also say, divine favor, that God gave him favor to go get to see his friends and minister to the church there. Now, the crazy thing that Paul is getting to go visit these Christians in Sidon, the crazy thing is, do you know why those Christians were in Sidon? Do you realize why they were there? They probably fled there from the persecution that Paul had started. Is that not wild? Many of those people lost their homes or their possessions or different things. It's because of Paul's evil persecution of the church that they had to flee there. And now those same people that had fled there under Paul's persecution are helping Paul. What a picture of Christian love and Christian redemption, that at least some of those people were probably driven there by Paul's persecution, and yet they were caring for him. What a picture of Christian love. Anyhow, in putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us, and when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra in Lucia. There the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. So there's a short layover, there's an uncertain itinerary. For me, that's really comforting because there's nothing spiritual, or it doesn't, a layover does not feel spiritual to me at all. And I have had so many layovers in my life. As a missionary who served in many countries, there's a lot of layovers. And you see this guy, in essence, he's trying to keep it to one layover, not two layovers, right? He's trying to find a direct flight. Unfortunately, there's probably going to be a second layover, because right now he's just trying to get to Italy, let alone to Rome. So it's important to remember, though, this is not a cruise ship, right? This is also not a schooner or cutter or something that can make good progress, that can sail almost against the wind. A good sailboat can go within 6 degrees of the wind and still actually be propelled forward by the sail that works like an airfoil. But this is not that. This is probably one of the giant grain ships, a grain freighter from Alexandria. Alexandria was the breadbasket of ancient Rome, and the Romans loved their bread. In fact, they would just eat the grains. That's what all of the Roman legionnaires would be given, grains, and they would just eat the straight grains. In fact, the fact that they didn't rebel when Julius Caesar had to feed them meat and produce, the fact that they didn't rebel when they didn't have their grain was a sign of Julius Caesar's leadership to everyone. Like, wait, your soldiers didn't have grain and they didn't rebel? You must be a sensational leader, right? They loved their grain, and so there was a constant supply of grain going up from Alexandria to Italy. And, typically Roman legionaries and legions, they got to travel on galleys or quinquirme, well-built, fast and light ships. But here he is on the ancient equivalent of a C-130 rumbling along, right? It's just a big, massive boat. In fact, I read that, remember how we talked about the Edmund Fitzgerald was carrying 26,000 tons of ore? Well, the largest grain freighters used to carry 13,000 tons of grain. Can you believe that? They had half of the capacity of the Edmund Fitzgerald back in Roman times. And it's incredible. But you can imagine trying to move a ship like that against a storm, what you would be up against. So we sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off of Cnidus. And as the wind did not allow us to go further, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salome. Coasting along with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, which was near the city of Lasea. And it's interesting that when Paul had gone to Europe the first time, the winds were with him to make him go really fast. And this time, all the winds are against him. And it probably feels very ominous just from that alone. But since much time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over. And of course, you guys understand what that means, right? You understand when the fast was, so right? Like everybody knows when the fast was in 59 AD. No, so it's October 5th, right? the fast of October 5th had already gone past. So you're already in this treacherous season of October, moving to late October. And I've been on Lake Erie a number of times, but there is no way I would want to be out on Erie after mid-October, especially to make a multiple-week trip, right? And that's just a lake. That's not this big sea. As we talked about, the lake, it is said, never gives up her dead when the gales of November come early, right? So you're hoping at that point that what happens in November doesn't come a little early this year. But Paul advised them, saying, "Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." So he's saying, we should not do this. We should chill out here a while, which, of course, you'd think, well, he's a prisoner. Of course he doesn't want to have to go to Rome. But he's speaking from a lot of experience from his multiple shipwrecks. But it's interesting here. He doesn't say, you know what, this is stupid, but I'm just going to pray and everything will be fine. Right? Sometimes we're tempted as Christians to get that kind of attitude. Like, you know what, this is foolhardy and foolish and shouldn't work out, but I'll just bless it and everything's going to be fine. Paul did not take that attitude. He didn't over-spiritualize it. He didn't say, Jesus stilled the storm, and so when the storm comes, that will certainly come upon us. We'll just pray for it to go away, and it'll all be fine. No, he wasn't presumptuous in heading out. I mean, did Jesus have power over the storms? Absolutely. Absolutely. Could Jesus still grant our prayers to still storms today? I believe he absolutely could. But will Jesus bless our impatience and foolishness by doing so? Probably not, right? The only reason they want to move on is because they don't want to be where they're at, right? That's just kind of human nature. We're always so focused on our destination, we can't enjoy where we're at right now. And so even though God could still the storm, even though he could stop the storm, there is a great difference between taking steps of faith and putting God to the test. There's a big difference there, right? If God had said, move forth in the storm, I will still it, it will not harm you, then you should go forward. But if he hasn't said that, don't be foolish, right? It's the difference between I think it's next section, we will see Paul getting bit by a venomous snake. He shakes it off, nothing bad happens to him, right? That doesn't give you the permission to have a row full of timber rattlesnakes in the front row and to take them out during praise and worship and start handling them. I don't know if you've seen in the news, but several pastors have died doing that because there's a big difference between Paul trying to collect firewood and getting bit by a snake or saying, let's give snakes the most prominent position in our church and pull them out and play with them while you make a bunch of loud music, right? The one is being the one is taking steps of faith. The other is putting God to the test. It says, but the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. Makes sense. It's hard to give a valid vote to the guy in chains, right, with the long beard and all scruffy and who can, barely see, maybe has goop coming out of his eyes. You don't usually give that kind of say to a prisoner like that. But there's something important to say here. The place that they're at is Fair Havens, right? And it's going to talk about how it's bad to winter in this place, but it seems to be that it wouldn't have been impossible to winter. It just would have been difficult, right? You have to maybe even pull the ship up. You have to unload the cargo, pull the ship up. Then you have to pay the crew to eat for the next 4 months, and you have to pay for somewhere to store it. And financially, it's probably going to be a wash, right? But then again, you don't lose your ship and your crew and your cargo. But also the sailors probably aren't liking it because this is not a typical place that people winter their ship, which means there's probably not a lot of gambling. There's probably not brothels. There's not all the stuff that sailors like to have. And so they're complaining that they should be stuck there. Right, but there's a reason it's called Fair Havens because it's relatively safe. Maybe not as safe as Phoenix, where they want to go, which is not Arizona. I know some of us like to go to Arizona to spend winter, not the same place that they're trying to get to. Right, this is still on the same island of Crete, the same island they're at. Technically, they could have walked over there while their boat was in the dock or on land. But the point is that, they want to get home, they want to see their wives, they want to make money, and so they're willing to take this risk. even though they are in a decent place. It says, because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there. So, if you ask any group of men, I don't know why we're so broken in this way, but you could ask any group of men, would you rather unload your 18-wheelers by hand or drive through Kansas while there's a tornado warning? What do you think most men would decide? Yeah, that's what I figured. Yeah, most men are saying, you know what, I really don't want to have to unload this and get it ready for a storm. I would just rather just drive right into it and take our chances. And that's pretty much what these guys are saying. They're like, look, yeah, instead of unloading the ship, let's just take our risk in tornado country. In fact, the Greek word that we're about to see here is typhonos, where we get our word typhoon. Let's take our chance with the typhoon rather than, staying here in a kind of boring place and having to unload the ship and reload the ship. So, on the chance that they somehow could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. So, I love Paul, and Luke. Luke, you know that he's very careful with his language. He says, on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix. He is using 3 conditional words there. If you're putting the hope of all your possessions, your livelihood, and your life on 3 conditional words, that's not really good, right? That on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, that's not a great chance. If you find you're risking your wealth and health on that many conditions, you should probably stop and reevaluate what's going on. But they weren't willing to stop and wait in safe havens. They wanted to go to a different harbor. And I think there's a word in this for us. First of all, I recognize, just as we talked about earlier during the announcements, there are lots of people who are in storms right now. There's lots of disease and death and difficult circumstances happening. And I think in those situations, you often just want to get to the other side of it, right? You just want it to be over. You want to get to the other side of it, whatever end that might be. For better or for worse, you just want to get to the other side of it and accept it. But there's something to be said for riding it out. When you're suffering, if I could go back in the last 2 or 3 years and redo something, I think I would give myself more permission to just let the emotions come, right? Not just push them off and push them away and try to act like they're not there. Just to let that come, let that go over me so that you come out healthier for it and that you're not pushing in half-cocked into a storm. Yeah, but also for us as a church, we're not in the location we want to be in, right? And I thank God for Southgate and the fact that we get to be here. I know many of us have talked about wanting to be at the next step, and I want to be there, and I've spent a lot of time chasing different things down. But the fact is, we're not going to go into one of those situations half-cocked, right? We're not going to say, well, maybe, somehow, perchance, it might work out if myself and the other elders leverage our houses to try to make this big jump, hoping that we're going to win more people along the way who are going to help pay the bills. Like, it's just seems foolish, right? And as much as I want to get to wherever God's going to have us, and as much as I hope that happens soon, as much as I hope that maybe, we can find some well-priced field even in the next month, to get a field to where you could eventually build something on. I would love to see something happen. As I was studying this passage, I felt like the Lord was really highlighting this and saying, don't be foolish, don't go out in half-cocked, don't go before things are ready, don't try to force something to happen and thereby presume upon what God's going to do. Be wise and specifically enjoy your time in Fair Havens, right? We are in a fair haven here. We're in a good place. There are great people across the way here. Our kids went to the VBS last week. There's just a fantastic group, and it's so fun just being able to fellowship with them. If you get to make it to the Hog Roast on August 2nd, to get out there and be part of the pie auction, it's great. It's a good place, right? It's maybe not exactly where we want to be eventually, but it's a good place, and I think it's much healthier to say, okay, let's enjoy our time in Fair Havens while we're here, and then leave healthy and full and rested, rather than to try to push and push and push and push and make something happen and find ourselves in a catastrophic situation where we could lose everything, right? So, I felt like that's something the Lord was pressing on me. And I hope we don't have to overwinter here, literally. But if we have to overwinter here so that we can make a good, strong, fresh start at the beginning of next year, then all right. Like, we're just going to trust the Lord. We're not going to act presumptuously. We don't want to do something that's going to cause us to crash the ship, so to speak, or get stuck in a shipwreck situation. But to proceed with wisdom and patience, which I know is not usually the rile 'em up, not the rile 'em up speech that you usually get from pastors, and saying, it doesn't matter, we got 10 people here, we're going to go forward and buy this 10,000 square foot area, and we're going to fill it by the grace of God. Maybe, if the Lord's spoken it, you will do it. If he has determined that in his sovereign will, it will happen. But if you're doing it just to rile people up and give them a long-term vision that you think would be incredible, that often doesn't go well. I know I've heard pastors say, never build anything that's going to embarrass you. And I have known a man who went to one of those churches, and they built a gigantic place. And I don't think they ever had 100 people in there, with room for probably 500. Right? And in fact, over time, it went from, like 80 to dwindling down to like 30 people sitting in a room for 500. And that can be an embarrassing place to be in. But I believe that by the grace of God, he will just continue allowing us to grow day by day, that we can enjoy our time in some fair havens. And when it's his time, we can proceed full of faith, full of vigor, full of resources to bring about what God is calling us to do. Yeah, so that having been said. Also, I don't know, I wasn't sure if I was going to say this, but just a little piece of encouragement that I was told this week, it can be encouragement for us. I find it actually kind of saddening, but the average church attendance in America is 60 people. So I know that many of us are comparing ourselves to the America we grew up in, and thinking, I think we're just a little church, and I think it's nice having a little church who serves a big God, going after, God's big plans and making a big impact for the size of our group. But the America we grew up in is no longer the America that is there. In the America that is there, this is an above average size congregation. Is that not wild? But somehow that gives me encouragement that even though this church is not like the one that I grew up in and not like the one you grew up in, that given the current milieu that we are in, God is working here and God is doing things. And we should be encouraged by that and know that slow growth is usually healthy growth. And once again, that's not the fire 'em up sermon that people like to bring, but that's the one that I see through most of the scriptures, right? Is that patient endurance, that day by day, as Paul says, that we would make it our aim that we should lead quiet and dignified lives. Quiet and peaceful lives, dignified in every way. Hey, that's not a fire 'em up sermon saying, you know what? Go to work, do your job, love your family, raise them in the fear of the Lord, and keep doing the good things that you're supposed to be doing, and things will turn out well over time. Right? That's not the fire 'em up sermon, but that's probably what got us into the bad place that we're in right now as a church in America. Right, is that we've had too many fire 'em up, silver bullet, let's grow your church from 100 people to 1,000 people overnight by stealing people from all the other churches because you got the best light show. We're going to steal people from all the other churches, let them dwindle away even though they were doing good discipleship. Now that we got so many people here that we cannot disciple them in any possible way, let's keep firing everybody up with a new sound and light show instead of just doing this work that God has called us to of constant love and discipleship and encouragement as long as it is. That's what God has called us to do, right? And like I said, that's not your fire 'em up sermon, but that's what I see throughout the scriptures. Now, are there moments of big breakthrough? Yes, but it seems to me the moments of big breakthrough are the moments that come from a buildup of years or decades of century, and then there's finally the breakthrough. Right? But you don't get the breakthrough until you get up that buildup of faithfulness, right? We talk about how the Word of God moved in the first century, and it did move in a powerful way, but that was after thousands of years of buildup of God being faithful with Israel and seeing to it that Israel was dispersed among the nations, so that in every city that Paul traveled to, there was a synagogue, or at least a collection of Jews where the gospel could be started, that there was that Brennpunkt, that point upon which a fire can be ignited. It was because of God's faithfulness over thousands of years that there was this gigantic breakthrough that went throughout the Roman Empire. Right? But people think that with no build-up, no history of faithfulness, no background of praying, that there's supposed to be a breakthrough like that. But I do know, and I can encourage you, I have seen every week people of this church earnestly seeking the Lord and praying that something would happen in this church, in this community. And I believe there is that buildup. And some of us, I can think of people in this church who've been praying for that for 75 years. And God's going to do something there. I know it. But we ought not think that he's just going to let things fall out of our lap. There is a buildup of faithfulness that goes to that. Anyhow, I'm getting way off topic. But here in 13, now when the south winds blew gently, supposing that they have obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete. So there's that supposition that they think, well, look, it's nice today. Let's go out on the weather. And they weigh anchor and sail along Crete, close to the shore. So the thought is, if we stay close to the shore, if things get really bad, then we'll just jump on the shore, hop off the boat. We might lose the boat. But Paul said, we'd lose our lives. But if we just stay close to the shore, it'll be fine. Right? Here's our chance. What could possibly go wrong? Famous last words. But soon a tempestuous wind called a nor'eastern, which if your weather pattern has a name, that's not a good sign. Right? Like all I have to say is Katrina, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. Because when a weather pattern gets a name, that's bad. And this was the worst name that you could hear as a sailor, as the nor'eastern. It's actually, they built its name out of Greek and Latin words, putting it together, giving it a very significant name. And it struck down from the land. So the idea was, we'll just stay really close to the land, and then we're safe until the storm winds come off of the land and push your giant freighter away from the land. Oh, crud. Things are not going according to plan. We are getting pushed way beyond our safety zone. This is not a good sign. It's kind of like in California. If anybody's been to California, all I have to say is Santa Ana. And people know exactly what that means. Because you say Santa Ana, it means somebody's house is going to burn. Right? There's certain weather patterns. You give it a name, and you know it's going to be bad. And so these guys say nor'eastern, and everybody jumps into, they see the shore getting further and further away, and they jump into their let's try to save the ship mode. But, there's also something to be said from oftentimes the most dangerous storms come from our place of safety. Right? They were looking at this shoreline as a place of safety, and exactly from there was the storm that pushed them out. And when our safe refuge becomes tempestuous, then everything goes haywire. But anyhow, when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. Now, once again, Paul does not just stand up and say, "Be still, O storm," like Jesus, right? They were being driven by this wind. And if you've been in a storm or you are in a storm, you will feel yourself being pushed by the storm. And that feels unspiritual when you know that you serve the Lord who has power over the wind and waves. But sometimes in life, you're just going to get pushed. And there's not going to be anything you're going to be able to do about it. If Paul can't do anything about it, I guarantee you're not going to do anything about it. Maybe Jesus gives you special grace and your storm gets to be stilled. But there's going to be some time in your life when you are pushed by the storm and you feel weak and vulnerable because you can't fight it, but it's just simply too strong for you. Right? That's been a lot of our last 2 years, just been pushed by a storm that was too strong for us. And often one is ashamed in that situation, thinking, if I just had enough faith. But I want to encourage you, sometimes it's just a strong storm and it's just going to push. Now, running under the lee of a small island called Clauda, We managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat, so they had to pull the dinghy up into the boat, which was probably really heavy. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. They threw ropes around it to pull it together because, they didn't have bolts back then. It was easy for a ship to get blown apart and sunk through that, so they used these supports. Then, fearing that it would run aground on the citrus, they lowered the gear and thus were driven along. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. So they pulled down the sails because they're being driven so hard already. And then that cargo that they didn't want to have to unload in Fair Havens, they're now throwing over the ship with their own hands. But it's interesting. It says they began the next day to jettison the cargo. That is, the crew's like, okay, let's get some of this off of here. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. So now they're even throwing over the implements of their sailing, just really giving up hope. The kind of terrible loss that happens when we venture into a storm. And when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest laid upon us, all hope of being saved was at last abandoned. So they are lost at sea. They have thrown off their cargo, their tackle. They're just being pushed along, and it seems like there will be no salvation. Paul has already warned them that if they try this, they will lose their cargo, their ship, and their lives. So at this point, it just seems like a prophecy of doom, right? This holy man of God said that we're going to lose everything, including our lives. And yet Paul is also on the ship. And there's this point of tension here in the story that's not to be overlooked, that we often find ourselves in a tension between the different things God has spoken. On the one hand, God has this promise to safely deliver him to Rome. On the other hand, everything is saying the ship will go down and everyone will die. And there's a clear tension there. And we also often live in this kind of tension where, for those of us in the storm of disease and sickness, you know that God has promised good things, that in the land of I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. And you know that he has the power to heal. And you know that he's a good God who has promised to bring you to his heavenly shores. And yet everything in your life seems to be saying the opposite. And also has been ultimately ordained by God. That even the suffering that we go through is, as they say in German, it went over God's desk. Right? He had to put a stamp on what was supposed to happen. And we often find ourselves in the tension of this already not yet kingdom where, on the one hand, we know that God has these exceedingly great and precious promises, but they have not yet fully come into fulfillment. And so we find ourselves stuck in this world and all of the suffering. And here they are tossed on the ocean for 14 days. As we'll find out next time. 14 days, they're just tossed back and forth. And maybe you've been in a place or are in a place where you are constantly tossed, where just you're being driven by the storm in your life and you're being thrown around and it seems like nothing else is happening except your life is being thrown back and forth, and you just hope it doesn't turn over or blow apart in the midst of this tension and this throwing. I want to encourage you. All the disciples went through this. Paul went through this. Luke went through this. This is not some strange thing that has come upon you, but by patient endurance you will save your souls. Don't give up hope. Just the fact that you've been, they were storm-tossed for 14 days. Some of us may be storm-tossed for 14 years, suffering with the same ailment or the same relational problem. But don't give up hope. And we'll see how God delivers them from this trial of being lost at sea in the next chapter. Heavenly Father, I pray that you would help us to not lose hope. Even though all the rest of the crew had abandoned hope, and sometimes we admit we do lose hope ourselves. Oftentimes that's when we give way to sins and temptations, when we feel like nothing's ever going to get better, nothing's going to improve, this relationship will always be bad, or my finances will always be terrible, my kids will always hate me, or work is always going to be terrible. It's never going to get better. That's when we're most susceptible to these storms, Lord. But I pray that we would not lose hope, that we would listen to Paul's command from the next one, that we do not lose courage, that we do not give up hope, that we cling to your promises even when there's no sign of anything but a prophecy of doom around us. Help us to trust in your goodness in the midst of all that. And give us your peace in the midst of the storm, the peace like the Moravians had in the midst of the storm when everyone else on the ship